Chapter 9. In the winter of 1911, Grandmother McNeil died at the age of 87, and the old home was broken up. I stayed at Park Corner until July, and on July 5th was married. 2 days later, my husband and I sailed from Montreal on the Megantic for a trip through the British Isles. Another dream come true, for I had always wished to visit the old land of my forefathers. A few extracts from the journal of my trip may be of interest. Glasgow, July 20th, 1912. Thursday afternoon we left for an excursion to Oban, Staffa, and Iona. We went by rail to Oban, and the scenery was very beautiful, especially along Loch Awe, with its ruined castle. Beautiful, yes, and yet neither there nor elsewhere in England or Scotland did I behold a scene more beautiful than can be seen any evening at home, standing on the old church hill and looking afar over New London Harbour. But then we have no ruined castles there, nor the centuries of romance they stand for. Oban is a picturesque little town, a fringe of houses built along the shore of a landlocked harbour, with wooded mountains rising steeply behind them. Next morning we took the boat to Iona. It was a typical Scottish day, bright and sunny one hour, showery or misty the next. For a few hours I enjoyed the sail very much. The wild, rugged scenery of cape and bay and island and bleak mountain, the whole of course peppered with ruined, ivy-hung castles, was an ever-changing panorama of interest, peopled with the shades of the past. Then too we had a cook's party of French tourists on board. They jabbered incessantly. There was one nice old fellow in particular, with a pleasant bronzed face and twinkling black eyes, who seemed to be the expounder-in-chief of the party. They got into repeated discussions, and when the arguments reached a certain pitch of intensity, he would spring to his feet, confront the party, wave his arms, umbrella, and guidebook wildly in the air, and lay down the law in a most authoritative tone and fashion. As the forenoon wore away, I began to lose interest in everything. Ruined castle, towering mountain, white torrent, ghosts, and French tourists lost their charm. In the morning I had been much worried because I heard that it might be too rough to stop at Staffa, and I wanted so badly to see Fingal's Cave. But now I did not care in the least for Fingal's Cave or for any other earthly thing. For the first time in my life I was horribly seasick. The steamer did stop at Staffa, however, and 2 boatloads went ashore. I let them go. What cared I? The waves would not have daunted me, the pouring rain would not have appalled me, but seasickness? However, the steamer was now still, and I began to feel better. By the time the boats came back for the second load, I was quite well, and once more it seemed a thing of first importance to see Fingal's Cave. I joyfully scrambled down into the boat and was rowed ashore with the others to the clamshell cave. From there we had to scramble over what seemed an interminably long distance, but really I suppose it was no more than a quarter of a mile, over the wet, slippery, basalt columns that fringed the shore, hanging in the worst places to a rope strung along the cliff. Owing to my much scrambling over the rocks of Cavendish Shore in early life, I got on very well, and even extorted a compliment from the dour guide. But some of the tourists slipped to an alarming degree. Never shall I forget the yelps and sprawls of the old Frenchman aforesaid. Nobody fell off, however, and eventually we found ourselves in Fingal's Cave, and felt repaid for all our exertions. 'Tis a most wonderful and majestic place, like an immense Gothic cathedral. It is hard to believe that it could have been fashioned merely by a freak of nature. I think everyone there felt awed. Even those irrepressible French tourists were silent for a little time. As I stood there and listened to the deep, solemn echo of the waves, the memory of a verse of Scripture came to me. He inhabiteth the halls of eternity. And it seemed to me that I stood in very truth in a temple of the Almighty that had not been builded by hands. We went on to Iona and landed there for a brief, hurried, scrambling exploration. Iona is interesting as the scene of St. Columba's ministry. His ancient cathedral is still there. Of greater interest to me was the burial place of the earliest Scottish kings, about 60 of them, it is said, finishing with that Duncan who was murdered by Macbeth. They were buried very simply, those warriors of ancient days. There they lie in their island cemetery beneath the gray sky. Neither storied urn nor animated bust mark their resting place. Each grave is covered simply by a slab of worn, carved stone. But they sleep nonetheless soundly for that, lulled by the eternal murmur of the waves around them. I would have liked to have spent several days in Iona, prowling by myself around its haunted ruins and getting acquainted with its quaint inhabitants. There is really little pleasure in a hurried scramble around such places in the midst of a chattering, exclaiming mob of tourists. For me, at least, solitude is necessary to real enjoyment of such places. I must be alone or with a few kindred souls before I can dream and muse and bring back to life the men and women who once dwelt there and made the places famous. We returned to Glasgow yesterday by water and were glutted with scenery. I was very tired when we reached our hotel, but weariness fell away from me when I found letters from home. How good they tasted in a foreign land. They bridged the Gulf of Ocean, and I saw the Cavendish Hills and the green gloom of the maple wood at Park Corner. Ah, beautiful as the old world is, the homeland is the best. July 30th, 1912, Royal Hotel, Princes Street, Edinburgh. Monday we went out to Ayr with a cook guide. As a rule, we dislike the cook parties and go alone wherever we can, but this expedition was pleasant, as there were only 2 besides ourselves, and they were Canadians, Mr. and Mrs. T from Ontario. We had also a very nice guide. 2 things subtracted from the pleasure of the day. It poured rain most of the time, and I had a grumbling facial neuralgia. But in spite of both drawbacks, I enjoyed myself. Where'er we trod, 'twas haunted, holy ground. We saw the room, the low-ceilinged, humble little room where once a cotter's son was royal born by right divine, and we explored the ruins of the old Alloway Kirk, made classic forever by Tam O'Shanter's adventures. Then we went to the Burns Monument, just because it was on the list of sights, and the guide was bound to do his duty by us. I have no interest whatever in monuments. They bore me horribly. But 2 things in the monument did interest me: a lock of Highland Mary's fair hair, and the Bible upon which she and Burns swore their troth in their parting tryst. Poor sweet Highland Mary! I don't suppose she was anything more than a winsome little country lass, no sweeter or prettier than thousands of other maidens who have lived and died, if not unwept, at least unhonored and unsung. But a great genius flung over her the halo of his love, and lo, she is one of the immortals, one of the fair ladies of old romance who will be forever remembered because of the man who loved her. She is of the company of Laura and Beatrice and Stella, of Lucasta and Julia, and of the unknown lady of Arvers' sonnet. Wednesday we went to the Trossachs. This is one of the expeditions I have looked forward to all my life, ever since I read The Lady of the Lake in school days. Sitting behind my old desk at school, I dreamed out the panorama of hill and lake and pass, where Ellen lived and Fitzjames wandered and Roderick Dhu brooded like a storm cloud over a highland hill. And I made a covenant with myself that when my ship came in, I should go and see it. We sailed up Loch Lomond to Inversnaid, and there took coaches for a 5-mile drive across to Loch Katrine. Of all the ways of locomotion I have ever tried, I like coaching best. It beats motoring hollow. We soon reached Stronachlachar, which in spite of its dreadful name is an exquisite spot, and took the boat down to Loch Katrine to the Trossachs pier. I cannot decide whether Loch Katrine disappointed me or not. I think it did a little. It was as beautiful as I had dreamed it, but it was not my Loch Katrine, not quite the Loch Katrine of my Chateau en Espagne, and I resented the difference, as one might resent a change made in his childhood's home on going back to it after long years. The lower portion of the lake is certainly much smaller than my idea of it as given by the poem, and the famous Silver Strand is a poor affair now. Since the installment of the Glasgow Waterworks, the lake has risen several feet and covered the beach of pebbles white as snow. I brought a handful of them home with me as souvenirs, but I think I shall keep the Loch Katrine of my dream in my geography of The Lady of the Lake. I like it better than the real one. We coached through the Trossachs to the Trossachs Hotel. The Trossachs is beautiful and grand, and perhaps before the carriage road was made, it was wild enough, especially for some benighted wanderer who had all too good reason to fear Highland plunderers. But it is far from being the wild, riven, precipitous dell of my fancy. No, it is not the Trossachs where I have so often wandered with Fitzjames. The hotel is in a lovely spot on the shore of Loch Achray. Where shall we find in foreign land so lone a lake, so sweet a strand? Yet Loch Achray, too, was on a smaller scale than I had expected. We walked along it that night as far as the Brig of Turk, gathering bell heather and bluebells as we went. Scottish bluebells are certainly the sweetest things. They seem the very incarnation of old Scotia's romance. Next morning we walked through the Trossachs to Loch Katrine in a pouring rain, and hired one of the boatmen to row us to and around Ellen's Isle. I don't think I liked it because it, too, was not the islet of my dream, and I was conscious of a foolish disappointment. Ben Venue, however, did not disappoint me. It dominates the landscape. Everywhere we went there was old Ben Venue, rugged and massive, with a cloud wreath resting on his summit hoar. I was very sorry that the night we spent there was wet. I should have loved to have seen a sunset effect on Ben Venue. August 6, 1912. Last Monday morning we went by train to Melrose and coached over 6 miles of most beautiful road to Abbotsford. Although we went on our own account, we could not help falling in with a Cook excursion, and this somewhat spoiled the day for us. But the scenery along the road is exquisite, and we saw the Eildon Hills, cleft in 3 by the spells of wizardry. Abbotsford is most interesting, crowded with relics I should have loved to have dreamed over in solitude, but that might not be. The rooms were filled by a chattering crowd, harangued by a glib guide. I wondered if Scott would have liked to think of his home being so overrun by a horde of curious sightseers. We drove from Abbotsford to Dryburgh, where Scott is buried. As we were able to escape from the cookies here, we enjoyed the magnificent ruin doubly. Then we returned to Melrose and explored the ruins of the abbey there. We could not follow Scott's advice, which I never believed he failed, as is asserted to take himself, and view it by moonlight. But in that mellow, golden-gray evening light, it was beautiful enough, beautiful and sad, with the little bluebells growing in its ruined courts and over its old graves. Michael Scott is reputed to be buried there, and there the heart of Robert Bruce was buried, and doubtless rests as quietly as though it had, according to his wish, been laid in the soil of the Holy Land. There is some wonderful hand carving still left in Melrose, and the little hand high up on one of the arches is as suggestive as it is beautiful. What fair lady's hand was chiseled there in lasting stone? One cannot but think it was wrought by a lover. On Wednesday we left for Inverness, but stopped off en route to visit Kirriemuir, the Thrums of Barry's stories. In particular, I wanted to see the den where Sentimental Tommy and his cronies held their delightful revels. It is a lovely spot. One thing about it made me feel at home. Its paths, which Barry calls pink, are the very red of our own island roads. I could have fancied that I was prowling in the woods around Lover's Lane. End of chapter 9.